I've been debating between these two watches for my own collection. It's the Rolex Explorer 2 versus the Tudor Black Bay Pro. Welcome to Wrist Swap, I'm Harrison. Today we're going to be talking through a design aesthetic that I've really liked for a long time of a fixed steel bezel for a traveler's GMT style watch, and why one of these will likely stay in my collection for a long time to come. So if we're looking at these watches from a design element, I think it's pretty clear that the Tudor Black Bay Pro is obviously taking a lot of design cues from something like the Rolex Explorer 2. It originally is taking a lot of the design cues from the 1655, which looks like this. This was the original Rolex Explorer 2 model, and you can see when you look at them side by side that they're quite similar. The main thing that stands out on the Black Bay Pro is going to be the overall vintage aesthetics. It's going to look very 70s. A lot of that is going to come from the general color selection between the yellow mixed with the black. And then obviously the steel bezel insert is going to very much reflect the older 1655 Rolex Explorer 2. Something to note when you look at Tudor's back catalog, you'll typically find that they're emulating some of their own models in terms of style and aesthetics. I couldn't find something in their back catalog that looked like an Explorer 2. So this is more of a pull from Rolex's back catalog rather than when they released the Black Bay 58 and it pulled from their own. The specs will be on the screen, but I'm going to talk about general aesthetics as we go over each watch. Some of the things that are going to pop out are going to be the fact that the matte dial is there, so it's not going to be glossy, not finished, just matte. It's going to absorb a lot of the light. It's going to look very tool-oriented because of that. You're also going to notice that the hands have a painted center pinion, which does a good job of making the hands stand on their own and kind of fade into the dial a lot. You're going to notice that there's snowflake hands on the GMT hand, on the seconds hand, and on the hour hand, which people have opinions on the snowflake hands. I like the hands themselves. I've griped before about how I wish the indices were squares and rectangles, which I share the same sentiment here, but they did some things different on this than the Black Bay 58 that I like. The main one being that the 12 o'clock indice is shortened and pushed up. And so what you end up with is the text moves up on the dial. I also really like how the markers between the hours have an outline around them. And that's very much what you would find on an older Rolex or Tudor model, where they used to do those outlines around the indices before they got rid of them. I'll do full reviews talking about all my thoughts, but generally you'll notice this is more of a vintage flavor. Rivet style bracelet actually captures that aesthetic quite well in this model. With the dial layout, I find that the bracelet fits the dial more than I felt like it did on the 58. But I'll go through my overall thoughts on the Black Bay Pro in a separate video. This is just comparing the two. For the Rolex Explorer 2, we know kind of what the general layout is. You're going to have the smaller indices. This is a 2011 model reference. So this is right at the end of the Explorer 2 before it turned into a 42 millimeter watch. So this is a 40 millimeter. It's a little smaller. Your indices are going to be smaller than the new versions, which have the maxi indices or maxi dial, whatever you want to call it. This has the red GMT hand rather than the orange one. So this, other than that, is going to have what you expect from a polar dial Explorer 2. You're going to have your fixed steel bezel. You're going to have the bigger numerals. They switched when they moved from the 1655 to all the Explorers since then to these larger numerals. And I can say by looking at these two next to one another that that makes sense. When you're further away from the watch, especially if I was, 2 feet away, I wouldn't see the indices on the Black Bay Pro. They kind of blend in because they're so fine. Whereas on something like this, I could hold it away from me and I'll still see the numbers pretty clearly. And I don't know if that was a functional reason or if it was a design thing to try and get people to recognize the watch. I don't know. But from a distance, this I know what it is and I can see that it has markings on the bezel. The Black Bay Pro from a distance looks more like a large fixed steel bezel, like on my Explorer 1, for example, except brushed rather than polished. This has crown guards, whereas the other one does not. General layout of the dial, you're going to find that this is going to look more modern. It's going to have a lacquer black finish over white gold indices, and it's going to have a lacquer style dial. So it's going to not quite reflect, but it won't have the same light absorbing capabilities as you'll see on the Black Bay Pro. For me, in terms of design aesthetic, I think I like the Black Bay Pro layout a little bit more than I like the Explorer 2 layout. especially on this model. I like the current Explorer 2 more than the Black Bay Pro, but this specific Explorer 2 model, I like the Black Bay Pro's dial more than this one. The only problem with the current Explorer 2 is that it's too big for me. Wearability. I'm gonna hit this pretty quick. I'll talk more about it in the Black Bay Pro video. The Black Bay Pro is gonna wear taller. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Most people expected it to wear a bit thicker, a bit heavier than the Explorer 2. This Explorer 2 is gonna have hollow center links, so it's gonna be very, very light. Their weight is on the screen right now. You can see that the Black Bay Pro is a heavier watch. One, it is thicker, and two, the bracelet itself is heavier. Both the clasp and the bracelet links are gonna be heavier, so it doesn't feel too heavy, but it's going to have more wrist presence than something like the Explorer 2. From my opinion, when I wear the Black Bay Pro, I notice it's there, I know that it's there. It's just like wearing a watch. With the Explorer 2, it's a lot like my Explorer 1. When I wear it, sometimes I forget that I'm wearing it at all because it's so light. So depending on what you feel like you like between those two, that's going to set your preference. For wearability, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Explorer 2 is going to be a better fit for me. You've probably heard me talk about wobbling and that I don't like it, so this is going to be more of what I like. I like to forget that I'm wearing the watch and it just to kind of disappear until I want to notice it. Pretty light, 135 grams or less is my ideal. All right, in terms of movements, I'm going to move through this quickly so that I don't inundate you with too much information. This is a caliber 3186. Main things to note there, it's going to have the parachrome blue hairspring with a Breguet overcoil, whereas the Black Bay Pro is going to have a silicone flat hairspring. I'll talk about that in a separate video, but those are the main differences. The overcoil is more of a traditional way to make a hairspring because it compensated for differences in power of the mainspring over time, whereas a flat hairspring didn't do that as well. At least that was the original concept. Both of them are going to be very anti-magnetic. Both of them are going to have good shock resistance. Both of them are going to have balance bridges, and they're going to have variable inertia balance wheels. So it's very difficult to kind of break these two apart without really getting to technical information, which is what I want to do separate. So from a high level, both movements are going to serve what most people are going to put them through, which is normal daily wear. So the Rolex is going to have a better movement overall. Main thing to differentiate, the 3186 only has a 48 or 50-hour power reserve, and the Black Bay Pro has a 70-hour power reserve. So the bracelet or strap is kind of a no-brainer. The Tudor's got a better bracelet. It's obvious. It's got the T-fit adjustment system in the clasp. I think it's pretty safe to say that that is going to be a better wearing experience because you can adjust it as your wrist swells and contracts. Whereas the Rolex is going to be the size that you put it at. You've got the traditional holes for micro adjustment. You've got a pressed fold-over clasp that's been stamped out, whereas obviously the Tudor has a milled clasp. Tudor also is going to have these ceramic bearings for closure. So it's very safe to say that that bracelet is superior to this one. The one caveat being that typically I don't like rivet style bracelets, but in this case, because of the vintage aesthetic that you find with the Black Bay Pro and the tool aesthetic that you have with the matte dial and non-glossy or polished indices like you have on the Black Bay 58, I find that the bracelet works better for the dial, at least from a design standpoint. I still don't love it more than the Oyster, but it tends to work better on this model than it did on the other. Overall, bracelet-wise, I gotta give it to the Black Bay. If you're keeping track so far, both of them have won two different categories. So right now we're gonna talk about brand. And it's really hard to delineate these two because they come from the same family. Rolex is gonna have the background of the name brand that most people recognize, but both are the brainchild of the same man. Granted, a lot of people will say that Tudor is either a poor man's Rolex, or it's copying Rolex, or it came after Rolex. You could say whatever you want to say, but I think in our modern age, if you look at these two brands and you look at what they do, what you're going to find is that they're very similar in terms of design, in terms of functionality, in terms of daily use. You can get into the nitty-gritty, but generally, overall, what you're going to find is that they're quite similar, with the separation being that Tudor is a little bit more tool-oriented. They're a little bit more of what Rolex was in the 50s. Whereas Rolex now is obviously going to be a more luxury item. They had to be. And so I think you're going to find a difference there. One of the key elements to talk about when you talk about brand, though, if you're into watches, is going to be general resaleability. And that's where we get into the conversation about price. I think it's pretty safe to say, and most people know, that Tudor Black Bay Pro is going to be $4,000 right now at retail on a bracelet, whereas something like the Explorer 2 is going to vary. Your Explorer 2 polar dials, like this model from between the 80s to the early 2000s, is going to be the last piece of Explorer 2s that were in 40 millimeters. Here's the difficult part. When I first got into watches and I first wanted to buy an Explorer 2, this watch right here is a polar dial. I remember being $6,000. Now, if you came to me 3 years ago and said, do I want this for $6,000 or the Black Bay Pro at $4,000, I think it would have been a no-brainer for me. I would have gone for this. And that has to do with movement architecture and generally wearability. That leads me into my next point, which is that I don't think that this will ever be in a smaller size. Because why would it? If they built this in a 58 size and they made it as thin, then it would be a direct competitor with the Explorer 2. Maybe they'll do it, and maybe I'll be wrong, but Tudor generally is going to have a different watch than Rolex. They have to. And they have to have a slightly discounted version of it. So if we look at the Black Bay 58, you're going to have an aluminum bezel insert, whereas obviously your Submariner is going to have a ceramic bezel insert. You're going to have a non-adjusting bracelet at the moment, and in the Rolex Submariner, you're going to have the glide lock bracelet. There have to be differentiators between the two, otherwise they're going to cannibalize their own sales. So if they released this watch with the steel fixed bezel and at the same thickness as the Explorer 2 in this size, then the only differentiator between this watch and this watch would be brand, would be general movement architecture, although it's difficult to explain why one is significantly better than the other, at least in terms of price points that they're talking right now, and size. So if you have a smaller wrist or you like a smaller watch, and you're going to go for this one every time. So I think it's important to note that. And I think it's important to also note in terms of resaleability that if people think that this price is too much right now, which I agree, it's at least more than it used to be, and so it feels like it's too much, it still is going to have a better resale value than the Black Bay Pro. Let's say, for example, this drops to $6,000 like it was 3 years ago. This won't be reselling for $4,000 still, because people will push and buy this. Now, $2,000 isn't a small amount of money, but there's a certain separation between the two that you have to have in terms of price for it to start to make more sense to buy one over the other. And I think the resaleability of this is going to change the resaleability of this. I think the demand for this is driven in large part by the price demanded for this. So the big question, in my mind, which one am I going to likely keep? That's tough. If I take sentiment out of it, because I'll go through an actual video of the Explorer 2 and my honeymoon with it, this has a lot of background to it now. Where I got it, when I got it, what I used it for when I first bought it, and all of that is going to play into my decision. If you're asking between the two, which one would I keep? If I had all the money in the world, the Explorer 2. If I had sentiment, the Explorer 2. But if you're asking me if I walked into a shop and I had $10,000 and I either got to buy this or this, I probably would get the Pro and I pocket the extra money. But something in the back of my mind would think maybe one day I'd sell it, and I wouldn't do that with this. I don't think that answers the question about which one. It's complicated, but I think that gives generally what my thoughts are. If this was thinner and this was the same size as this, I would pick this every time. But which one's a better value for money right now? The Black Bay Pro, hands down. The different upgrades you get for your overall price are probably not worth it. They are to me, but they might not be worth it for almost everyone else. And I still struggle with it. Do me a favor and subscribe. Thanks for watching if you made it this far. Drop a like if you like videos like this. I really have fun with these comparison videos and kind of rambling my thoughts. Let me know in the comments, what do you guys think? Is there something I missed? Is there something I got wrong? Do you disagree? The next video will be my actual review of the Black Bay Pro, so I'll go through everything that I have to say about it in detail in that video, and some of the movement information that I know and that sort of thing. So I'll see you guys next time where I talk about it. Till then, take care.